Welcome to India Tomorrow, conversations with the next generation of political leaders. We are doing many more programs on India, and we are so excited for this lineup. We have 160 people signed up in the audience. With us, our chair, Ken Wilcox, about 10 board members. We also have our groundbreaker and innovator members. Thank you for your support. We do have colleagues joining us from our India Center and also our Southern California Center. I'm Margaret Conley, the Executive Director of the Northern California Center. A big thank you to our promotional partner, the Institute for South Asia Studies at UC Berkeley. Our format for today, I'm going to introduce James Crabtree, who is our moderator. He's joining us from Singapore. He'll introduce our three guest speakers. They'll have a moderated discussion, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. If you have questions, and you can start those anytime now, put those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. All speaker bios are on our website, and they're also in the link in the chat box down at the bottom of your screen. This program is on the record, and we are recording. We'll do this event for an hour. And now we'll go to James Crabtree. A few words about him. He's the Associate Professor of Practice at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. His courses are on leadership and communication and the impact of the 2008 financial crisis. James, one of our star interns, is one of your students, and he's in our audience, Shashank. And before Singapore, James worked for the Financial Times as the Mumbai bureau chief covering India business. He's also a columnist from the Nikkei Asian Review, and he also has a best-selling book, The Billionaire Raj, A Journey Through India's New Gilded Age. So James, thank you very much for joining us. I think this is the first time you've joined us as a moderator at our center. It's all yours.
Hi, thank you very much, Margaret. It's delightful to be here. Welcome from Singapore, where it's 10 o'clock in the morning and sunny outside. Thankfully, just about COVID-free in this part of the world. So we're here to talk about India Tomorrow, which is a fabulous new book co-authored by two of our guests, Pradeep Chhibber of Berkeley, a distinguished academic and professor, and Harsh Shah, currently at Harvard Business School, although previously at Berkeley as well. And the book is a collection of portraits of nearly 24 of India's future leaders or younger generation of political leaders. It's a remarkably revealing collection. When I was reading it, one of the things I admired about the way that Pradeep and Harsh had approached this is how deft their questioning was, how they didn't leap in and ask about the current issues of the day, but they were interested in understanding who these people were, what their psychology was, what made them tick. So we learned about Priyanka Gandhi's cooking habits and Rahul Gandhi's rather mysterious fascination with the history of the Mongols, amongst a whole array of other rather interesting factoids on the coming generation of Indian politics. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take the first 45 minutes to hear both from Harsh and Pradeep about some of the characters that they met and what they made of them, and also hear from Barkha Dutt, who I'm sure most of you already know, journalist extraordinaire, multiply published author, gazillion Twitter followers, and much else besides. So Barkha is joining us from India this morning. So that's about enough from me, except to say that we will leave 15 minutes at the end.
Get to as many of those as we can. So with that, let me start by, I think, Harsh, you're going to kick off. I mean, this is an interesting project. So tell us a little bit about how it came to be. How was it that you ended up interviewing all of these politicians, and how did you go about choosing who you were going to interview?
Thanks, James. Yeah. So the first thing I'd say is that, Professor Chhibber and I never planned to ever write a book together or, embark on a project like this. What it happened very organically. When I was still at Berkeley, together we would organize a lot of these political events where we flew down speakers from India to Berkeley, got them to engage with the community, with the students. We would do interviews, we do different kinds of Q&A sessions, we do large speaker events. So we got people like Shashi Tharoor, we got Arun Jaitley to join as a virtual event. We got Rajdeep Sardesai, we got Milind Devra, we got a few more politicians to come, and started this speaker series. And we always saw a lot of great interest among the community there in learning not just about their day-to-day political views, but more about their, just trying to get a sense of their personalities behind their public personas. And this was, magnified when we had Rahul Gandhi come in 2017. There were lines outside the campus, and it really made waves across India as an event where the central government had ministers coming and doing press conferences to respond to some of the claims he had made. More fascinating to us was the fact that there was a lot of interest in understanding who he was as a person. And a lot of people came to us and said, we really didn't get a sense of him and his ideology, his personality, his motivations before this event. And this event has really changed our perception of him. Not going to get into better or worse, but just changed it somehow. So that was really the impetus behind us thinking about doing a speaker series, not to go into day-to-day politics, but more to, with two main objectives. The first, as you said, understand their motivations, their personalities, their influences, also some personal tidbits as the ones you mentioned. And two, understand, what are their policy ideas for India's future? What are the challenges some of them have faced already or anticipate facing as they try to implement these policies? And we hoped that being outsiders, not being adversarial journalists in India, not being associated with the political system might help us get them to be more candid. That was our hope. And I hope that, readers felt that we were able to achieve that. So that was really the way we went about it. To answer your second question, how did we go about choosing the list? It was a very iterative process. So we started with a long list of about 40 to 50 people, but we'd always run that with journalists, politicians, academics, general friends and family to understand who they liked, who they didn't. Often what would happen, we'd do one interview and then we'd ask the politician, we'd show them the list and say, in your interactions, who's great? Who do you think would add value to the book? And we'd constantly adjust the list based on that. But of course, we had certain requirements and filters. One of them being that we wanted everyone to be below the age of 50. That was a somewhat arbitrary cutoff point that we set ourselves, trying to get the next generation of politicians. We, of course, wanted diversity in terms of region, caste, religion, gender. And we definitely wanted the ability to meet them in person, spend enough time with them, and have a completely unscripted interview with no questions or topics shared in advance. So this was the lens through which we wanted to approach it. And that's how we went about it.
Very good. Okay, well, let's dive straight in. So I think potentially the reason why Mr. Rahul Gandhi is interested in the history of the Mongols is that his political position facing the BJP is not dissimilar to a country facing a Mongol invader. And so let's start with the kind of central fact of modern Indian politics, which is Narendra Modi and the BJP. In the book, one of your earlier chapters is on Fadnavis, the former chief minister of Maharashtra. And in that interview, he talks very interestingly about the role of religion and the RSS in Indian politics. Previously, when we discussed, we talked about the fact that you had tried also to interview Yogi Adityanath, the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh, but that was not one you managed to do. But the two of them together present a very intriguing contrast in terms of the future vision of the BJP, the direction that this party may take India in the next generation. And so I wondered if you could talk about what you learned from the Fadnavis interview in particular, and what your reflections were. And Pradeep, I think you're going to speak to that one. So,
yes, thank you, James, for moderating. Thank you to the Asia Society for giving us a chance to speak about the book. And thank you, Barkha, who we'd actually for a very long time when we were running the speaker series tried to get to Berkeley, and we finally managed, even if it's in a virtual environment. So thank you, Barkha. But let me get to your question about Devendra Fadnavis, the RSS, and in some senses, the other face of the BJP, which is Yogi Adityanath. And I'd just like to say, start by saying the BJP is a coalition. It is not a party with a uniform ideology as we think of. Fadnavis comes from the RSS camp, and Yogi Adityanath comes from a much more Hindu traditionalist camp. In fact, Yogi Adityanath in 1991, if I recall correctly, wanted to contest elections, student elections, on the ABVP ticket, which is the student wing of the RSS, and he was not given a ticket. And he's always has strained relations with the BJP. In fact, in 2002, if I recall once again correctly, his candidate actually defeated a sitting BJP minister in Gorakhpur. So in other words, there's always been some tension between the BJP and the RSS and the Hindu traditionalists. And the reason for this is the following. The Hindu traditionalists have a very different view of what it means to be a Hindu and what it means to govern as a Hindu. Whereas the RSS's view is much more ethno-nationalist. So when you think of Fadnavis's interview, he's thinking of the Hindu in the much more RSS sense, which is ethno-nationalist, which raises issues peculiar to itself. And meanwhile, somebody like Yogi Adityanath comes from a much more traditional camp. In fact, the founders of the Gorakhpur Mutt were parts of the Hindu Mahasabha, which is actually a Hindu traditionalist organization which wants to preserve traditional religious values. And I think the RSS is not particularly interested in religious values. They are much more interested in what we would say ethno-nationalism. That's the first thing. The other thing I think we should keep in mind is that the politics of Maharashtra and the politics of UP are extremely different. So in some senses, Maharashtra is the commercial, Mumbai is the commercial hub of India. The demographics of Maharashtra are different than the demographics of UP. And in Maharashtra, the coalitional politics are also different. So in Maharashtra, in Mumbai, you have the Shiv Sena, which is already occupies in some senses what we would say a little bit a party to the right of the BJP on the Hindu question. And I think the Shiv Sena is quite proud of its Hindutva lineage and its leanings. And so I think when you think of Fadnavis's responses, they're couched in Hindu nationalist frame, but they're also ethno-nationalist frame, but they're also couched in this, what I would call a reaction to the politics of Maharashtra, which would not perhaps permit him to take the much more extreme views that a Yogi Adityanath can take much more successfully in UP and also in UP, where Yogi Adityanath is visited. That's where the Hindu Mahasabha and the Ram Rajya Parishad, which are the two major competitors to the Jan Sangh in the 1950s, existed and were founded. So I think it's the politics of the day. And keep in mind, the BJP is a coalition, and this coalition need not necessarily hold together.
Barkha, can I bring you in here? I mean, you spend a lot of time on the ground, you know all these figures, you have a sense of the sheer dominance of the BJP as a force in Indian politics now. But in a sense, if you look at these different visions, these different factions within the BJP, where do you see the future lying?
So thanks, James. I think the BJP today is completely unrecognizable from the BJP, let's say 15 years ago. So to that extent, I partially disagree with Pradeep. I agree with the part that says that it's a coalition and there isn't one monolithic idea of the BJP. But I think there is a monolithic personality driving the BJP today, and it is that of the Prime Minister. So it in fact begins to feel less and less of a coalition of ideas and personalities to me in the present day sort of way in which politics is unfolding, where forget national elections, even to win state elections, Bihar is the first election that's taking place where we're not post the pandemic, but in the middle of the pandemic, we're having an election. I'm just back from there. And you need the Prime Minister to do the heavy lifting, even for a state like Bihar. So I guess what I'm saying is, and we can talk about this as we go along, the BJP today is very much the party of Narendra Modi. And Mr. Modi the popularity is that of Mr. Modi. It is not that of the BJP. And in fact, you can almost separate the responses of voters on these two things. You will have people say a lot of critical things about the BJP when you talk to people, but they will be much more forgiving and much more permissive for Mr. Modi to make his mistakes. And I would say, for example, the migrant crisis that erupted in the wake of this pandemic that I reported closely on the ground, it was a humanitarian crisis of gigantic proportions. It was not thought through by this government. In any other country, it would be the lead story everywhere. it's one example of how the Prime Minister and his government are forgiven all manners of mistakes just because the BJP today is so strongly the party of Narendra Modi.
I would actually
One
agree.
of the reasons.
Sorry,
Oh,
I would
sorry,
agree.
Pradeep, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry, I would agree with Barkha. I think currently the BJP is precisely the party of Narendra Modi in some senses. It's been made in his image. But the question is, he will not be prime minister forever. Nobody lives forever. And the question is, what happens after that? Will this tension between the traditionalists and the nationalists break out in the open, or will it not? We do not know. That's the question, right? Okay.
So I suppose the question of post-Modi politics also brings us to the moribund state of the Congress party. And so two of the most revealing interviews were with Priyanka and Rahul Gandhi. The Priyanka Gandhi interview in particular was very thought-provoking and intimate in the way that she talked about her life, her family, the struggles that she has had with her privacy. Nonetheless, on this broader point, about the dominance of the BJP and whether there is a route back for the Congress party, they both basically put out the line in your interview that there isn't really a problem with the Congress party's ideology. It's simply a problem of how they've been delivering it. Rahul Gandhi talked about BJP propaganda. Priyanka Gandhi was more inwardly critical of the Congress. I wondered what you made of that. And in a sense, I mean, at a basic level, is the kind of historical position of the Congress party now finished, or is there a road back under the leadership of this family? Harsh, do you want to have a go at that one?
Sure. Yeah. So as you said, we sensed from both of them that they both talked about their manifesto, and they both talked about how the Congress ideology is alive and well and kicking, and they've given it a lot of thought, and they've actually that it was manifested well in that document, the manifesto, which they thought wasn't disseminated well enough to the public, wasn't communicated well enough. Priyanka Gandhi seemed more willing than Rahul Gandhi to concede that, they've kind of lost ground. They've been unable to catch up with the new media. They failed in their communication. Rahul Gandhi's view was a lot more that, we were just fighting. We have a clear ideology, but we're fighting an institutional machinery where you have pliant media, you have subservient institutions, you have political capture of different institutions, you have a lot of resources that the BJP has, including far greater funding. Priyanka Gandhi, in our view, was a lot more candid, or at least willing to concede that the Congress is playing catch up. But my personal view is that the ideological space for their ideology is shrinking. The BJP's is resonating far greater with the masses. This is something we asked both of them. They didn't have great answers, as you know, but my view, and would love to hear Barkha, would love to hear Professor Chhibber, but my personal view is that the space for their version of this, of India and its idea is really shrinking, and we're seeing the opposite happen for the BJP.
I mean, Barkha, what's your sense of this? I mean, the Congress party doesn't seem to be able to catch a break. I mean, it had demonetization, it has an enormous pandemic. There are all sorts of things that have gone wrong in India, and yet Modi's as powerful as ever, and the Congress doesn't really seem to be able to kind of find its footing. So what do you see on the ground in terms of what you hear from people about the party?
So I'd say that some of the things that Rahul Gandhi said to Harsh and Pradeep are partly true, in that there is a great machinery that the BJP has at work, whether it's its electoral machinery, whether it's its narrative building machinery, whether it's the fact that mainstream television in large part is very, very supportive of the government, embarrassingly so. So all of that is true, but that cannot take away from the lack of imagination that the Congress has displayed, the lack of political energy, the lack of consistency, and I would say even the lack of ideological consistency. So let's take Rahul Gandhi saying today that, look, we fought the good fight and we're going to keep fighting the good fight. No, the Congress panicked on the issue of where to locate themselves vis-a-vis the perceived pivot to the right in India. Suddenly, in some elections in 2019, you had Congress leaders talking a lot more about Hinduism, or almost offering a kind of Hindutva light to the BJP's harder Hindutva line. You had a bizarre reference to a caste reference to Rahul Gandhi by his party, talking about what's called the Janayu, which is a sort of Brahminical thread that some people, have ceremonies to be associated with, and it's a statement of caste supremacy. And for a self-professed liberal leader who has a different idea of India, that was a very strange reference. So all of these have reflected a certain degree of panic with how to adjust to this new India. And finally, you spoke about the pandemic, and one thing that really struck me, I spent about 120 days traveling across India from the north to the south. I covered about 24,000 kilometers. And as I was walking a lot with the migrant workers on the highways who were leaving the cities and walking hundreds of kilometers back to their villages, I would see on my phone that Rahul Gandhi was doing Zoom interviews of various people around the world. And I would be like, what? Why? What's he trying to do? Is he trying to be a broadcast host? Is he trying to be a man of ideas? At this time of national crisis, it was an opportunity for him to get out there. If some of us as journalists could do it, why could he not be out? Why could his sister not be out on the streets? We see very little committed, consistent 24/7 politics from the Gandhis. And even that comment that Priyanka made to Harsh and Pradeep about her cooking, and did she mention scuba diving? Like, maybe she thought that humanized her as a political portrait. For a lot of Indians, that just conveyed elitism. It just conveyed this disconnect. Like, you would never hear Narendra Modi and Amit Shah talking about enjoying cooking and taking some holidays to do scuba diving. I cannot imagine this interview happening with anyone, in the BJP right now. So to me, it reflected that kind of elite dissonance from the ordinary Indian.
I would actually
add
something to it. When the last national election was happening, you could see Congress politicians who were in charge of states walking the streets in Delhi instead of working their states, and Congress politicians, traveling in the United States, which I think no BJP politician would be. So I think that's fair and well, but and this is a part for a longer conversation we can have later. I think the belief that the Congress's ideology is dead is a bit of a stretch. I think there are many, many people who resonate with the idea. I think it's still an old brand. I think it has still the central ideas it has of pluralism and tolerance and, still have place in India. And I think they have a powerful place in India. It's just that, you need full-time people, and I would agree with Barkha to articulate it.
I think certainly the idea that Narendra Modi might have talked about his passion for free diving is unlikely in modern India. Let's move on. So Barkha used the phrase Hindutva light or Hindu light, the idea that the Congress has been edging towards a more religious agenda. And so that brings up the question of religion itself, and particularly the role of minorities. So you had two very striking interviews with two of the most articulate and interesting Islamic politicians in modern India, Omar Abdullah, the former chief minister of Kashmir, and Owaisi, the leader of a minority, predominantly Muslim party from the south of India. And I thought Abdullah was particularly interesting because he speaks to the issue of Kashmir. And I wondered, in fact, how it was you were able to interview him, and when you did, given he'd been under house arrest for such a long time. But I wondered what you took out of these interviews with the prominent Muslim politicians whose tone was at times close to despairing, really, about the position of minorities in modern India under the kind of rule of the BJP and the direction of travel. So Pradeep, do you want to take that one?
Harsh, do you want to speak very briefly about the interview with Omar Abdullah, and I can take the religion part after that?
Absolutely. Yeah, so we actually ended up having Omar Abdullah's interview in two parts. And funny enough, we did probably his last interview before he got detained. And of course, everything changed after 5th of August, in 2019, after the revocation of Article 370. We could not contact him for many months after that. And the book was soon going to go into publishing. And we were going to have to just put a small footnote there saying that he's in detention, and we couldn't really interview him again ever since those events. Luckily, he was released, and we reached out to him in a desperate call, and eventually had a Zoom interview during the pandemic, just about 8 or 10 days after his release. So his first interview after his detention, and it was interesting. I mean, you could feel it was very palpable, his emotional stress, his anger, his frustration, his sense of resentment. But of course, there was a great sense you could feel that he feels marginalized, a bit lost. At that point, he told us that he's not sure if he'll ever contest an election again. He wasn't sure about his political future. He hadn't had time or the opportunity, given the pandemic and lockdown, to interact with his party colleagues and chart in the next course of action. So you could really feel the roller coaster of emotions that he went through come out in the interview as well. And that's why for us, it was a very memorable interview, not just because of the political relevance, but also because of the kind of experience that we went through just speaking to him.
And I think, let me get back to the question. I would like to distinguish between Farooq Abdullah and Asaduddin Owaisi. Sorry, Omar Abdullah and Asaduddin Owaisi. Omar Abdullah's interview is focused mostly on Kashmir. And I think Barkha knows a lot more about Kashmir. I think the Muslim question is not what's driving Omar Abdullah at all. It's actually the question of Kashmir. And I'll just say one thing, which is political science, that Kashmir, unfortunately, as events transpired, is for most Indians what political scientists call a valence issue, in which there is a broad consensus among voters about what should be done. And I think that's a real challenge. And I think I'd like to hear what Barkha thinks, because my guess is, and this is just my guess, that given the BJP's ascendance and the fact that Kashmir remains a valence issue in the minds of most Indian voters, my guess is the BJP is not going to relent on what they've been doing in Kashmir, and I think they're going to continue down this path. Asaduddin Owaisi, on the other hand, is a much more interesting interview, and I think he despairs not only about the Muslims, he also despairs about youth. And I think what's really interesting about his interview, which I think everybody should read just for that he actually, in the end, when we ask him, what would you like to be remembered as? He says, I would like to be remembered as a constitutionalist. And the reason is quite simple, that the Indian Constitution is the best protection right now of minorities against any kind of majority rule, is the preservation of the rule of law and the constitutional rights guaranteed to minorities in the Constitution. And I think Asaduddin Owaisi is generally despairing not only of Muslims, he's also despairing of the state of debate in parliament. He's also despairing of the fact that parliamentarians don't do their work. He's also despairing of the fact that the political parties are actually taking the Muslim vote for granted. And what he's trying to do, which I think is interesting and clever, he's trying to create a Muslim political party, but he's trying to create a Muslim political party from the ground up. He understands the political reality that making a Muslim political party in India that is going to be powerful at the national level is much more difficult because of the distribution of Muslim voters in various constituencies across India. So he knows that the right path for him is to actually win seats in local areas, because that is one way you can give the Muslim community voice politically locally. Because if you try to play the national politics, the ability of you to win seats is going to be much, much more difficult. So I think he's not despairing only of the Muslim community, he's despairing of politics in general and the status of the youth in particular. He actually said, if I remember right, that India's policies towards the youth are a disaster.
I mean, Barkha, I spent a few days with Owaisi when I was a journalist in India, and he's certainly an extraordinary, captivating intellectual politician and also immensely hardworking. And I was quite won over by him. I thought he was an interesting guy, but not successful in any substantive sense. And neither in a sense is Omar Abdullah. So what is your sense of the position of these politicians who are representing minorities, but particularly Muslims, in their own, either in Kashmir or in Owaisi's case?
So I would agree with Pradeep in separating what's happened in Jammu and Kashmir from the larger question of the Indian Muslim. In fact, I would also argue that if you speak to Muslims outside of Kashmir, there is no affiliation, zero affiliation with the Kashmir issue, right? So I think that's very, very important to understand that, because I think the global media often looks at Kashmir as an extension of the conversation around the place of Indian Muslims. But if you have these conversations with Muslims in the mainland, they will most often feel irritated that the kind of ethno-separatism that is quite strong in parts of the Kashmir Valley is somehow used to judge and test their nationalism. And so, in fact, quite distinct from identifying with many groups in Kashmir, there's a kind of distaste and an anger and an annoyance with what's going on in Kashmir, even among, and especially among, I would say, Muslims in the rest of India. That's the first point. The second point is, I think Pradeep is right, that the BJP has done a dipstick test and found that its very disruptive, contentious decisions in Jammu and Kashmir have a large electoral endorsement to the extent that even people, several individuals from the Congress, Jyotiraditya Scindia left the Congress, but he supported the abrogation of Kashmir's special status while he was in the Congress. Dipinder Hooda is another young leader who supported this abrogation. He's still in the Congress. So that's the kind of disruption that the Kashmir decision created. Personally, do I believe it's smart to lock up your mainstream leaders who have always stood with India? I think it's terribly unsmart. I think you have given the separatists a chance to say, we told you so. You have ended up actually doing the opposite of your own muscular nationalism, because you've gone and locked away the people who have, on the ground risked their lives to take part in the larger Indian project, the democratic project. So I don't think what's been done is smart, but do I think the BJP has any sort of remorse or any recalibration here? None whatsoever. This has worked for them politically and they're going to carry on. On the Owaisi question, you see, Owaisi, he's a very interesting character because he will have great criticism of the Modi government. But if, for example, there's a critique that comes from Pakistan of the place of the Indian Muslim, Owaisi will be at the forefront of telling the Pakistanis where to get off in that conversation. So he really sees himself as a kind of ferocious constitutional nationalist. And I wish we could spend some time talking about constitutional patriotism as opposed to electoral nationalism, because I think what's happened in India, and which is why the country appears to have pivoted right, is the surrender of the liberal left, the surrender of the progressives in this space, allowing the right wing to co-opt a space, which is very important to many Indians. There's a self-identifying thing that happens with the Indian state, the concept of the Indian state. And the right wing has been able to completely build a political edifice on it, whereas the progressives have just surrendered that space. And Owaisi is reclaiming that space at a time when many Muslims feel that they're being pushed out of the larger sort of Indian project. He's saying, this is my country and you're not going to take it away from me. And this is mine and I'm here. And I just wish many more sort of liberals would also say that about their country instead of constantly saying, oh my God, India is so terrible. There's a reclaiming of India that's needed that people like Owaisi are doing. And I think full marks to him for trying to do it.
That's fascinating. Yeah, constitutional patriotism is a much better kind of vision, I think. So there's a lot in what you say, Barkha. Let me pause for a minute and say that we are open for questions in just a minute. And indeed, I'm going to bring in a couple now because I want to pivot away from this core narrative of the BJP and the Congress towards another big issue in Indian politics, which is the prevalence of dynasties. We've already talked about the Gandhis. We've had a few others, but the book is stacked with the children of politicians and the grandchildren of politicians. If you're looking for a break with the past, then this sure ain't it. I mean, maybe about half, I didn't count them, but maybe about half of the politicians you have in here are in some way dynastic. And so I wondered what you took out of that. You have Scindia, you have Sachin Pilot, you have Poonam Mahajan. what are we to take out of the kind of prevalence of these dynasts? And we had a couple of questions from the audience on this. So Daval Shah specifically asked about the Congress Party not being able to get away from dynastic politics. And we have a question from Liladar P. Please put your full name if you want me to read it out properly, saying, what are some of the constructive ways to move away from dynastic politics? So I don't know if you want to have a reflection on why there are still so many dynasts in this book of the next generation and have a stab at those. Harsh, is this one for you?
Yeah, I'll let Professor Chhibber take this one.
Okay, so James and thank you, and the audience members, thank you so much for the question. I think I just like to set the record straight, and I think this is, to James, it should be no surprise, that India doesn't have as many dynastic politicians as something like the Philippines or Japan. In fact, it has fewer elected dynastic politicians than in the Japanese diet. But what's unique about India, and I think this is something Harsh and I have been spent a lot of time thinking about, what's unique about India is that the political parties are controlled by dynasts. And I think that's what makes it really different, which is not the number of dynasts on the ground, but the number of dynasts who are actually controlling political parties. And there are many reasons for it. I think there are the obvious reason, which I think Barkha knows a lot about and can speak at much more length about, which I think is one is money, number one. Number two, these parties there are very weak social organizations that actually provide political support to these parties. So if you ask yourself the question of, we've been asked this question before, and I'll just say a couple of things. First, if you ask yourself, okay, if it's not going to be the Gandhis, who is going to lead the Congress, and would everybody agree? Who would agree? And who are the people who would agree to a common leader? There's always what is the alternative question? And I think most Congress politicians right now are a little bit afraid to make that leap into the unknown. And I think it's the fear of the unknown that prevents parties from doing. That's the first thing. The second thing, which I think I'd like to hear what Barkha has to think about, which is something Harsh and I have spent some time thinking about, which I think what dynastic politics has done to Indian politics is actually a lasting damage in the following way. That through the 1960s and 70s and even up until the 80s, most politicians who came to power through social movements. They ascended to power through social movements. What's happened now is that these leaders are actually following social movements. They're not the leaders of social movements, they're following social movements. And which is why, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say this, which is why, quite frankly, the BJP is not really scared of them. The BJP is more worried about a Hardik Patel who can lead a social movement than it is about a dynast who is actually just running a political party which is not leading a social movement, because that is not going to threaten the rise of the BJP. So to answer the question, what can we do about dynasts? That's a much more complicated question, and I think I'd like to see what people think. But I think this is why dynasties exist. And I think this is the tragedy of dynasties for Indian politics, is that it's actually created politicians who are not rooted in social movements, who don't lead them anymore. And think of all the young dynasts, right, who are running parties.
Barkha, what's your sense of this kind of long-running issue in Indian politics?
So I completely agree with Pradeep about how social movements are much more disruptive to the BJP than entitled inheritors of power. But I think the more interesting question for me is how voters think about this issue, right? Because it is a kind of trope that the big difference between Modi and the Gandhis is that one is a non-dynast and the other is, belongs to a political dynasty. I do think the Prime Minister gets points for being perceived as self-made, but I think what actually works for him is the perception of being non-elite. So I think it matters less whether you've inherited your power if you're seen to have earned it. It matters more if you've inherited your power and you don't seem to be out there earning it every single day. So a good example from the South is, for example, that of a man called Jagan Reddy, who's today the Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh, who initially was seen as this somewhat lazy, corrupt sort of son of a dynast. And then he reinvented that perception by undertaking a 1 year, what's called in India, Padyatra, a journey by foot across the state, going from house to house, meeting people, a kind of, a political Gandhi redux, as it were. And suddenly he was able to sweep the next election. So I think elitism and being a lazy politician puts more voters off than simply being a dynast. So I think that we need to understand the issue of dynasty in a much more complex way than the media does. I don't think it's a disqualifier. I think often it's a huge advantage in playing a unifying force in parties. I think Pradeep has already spoken to that. But I think in the new India, you cannot sit on your ass and expect your last name to do your work for you. And because what happens then is, if there is, for example, a disruptor like an Arvind Kejriwal, a kind of middle-class boy who industrious, that's how people perceived him, who made his way up, or a Modi, a tea vendor's son who made his way up, then those narratives are much more powerful compared with the dynast narrative. So what matters more is the story that you can tell about your own life. So the storytelling has become at the heart of Indian politics today. So whether you're a dynast or not, you better have a good story to tell. And I think the Congress is suffering because it doesn't have a good story to tell for its leaders.
So it's interesting, Barkha, that you mentioned Jagan Reddy, because in addition to Yogi Adityanath, he was the character who I was most hoping would be in here and isn't. So maybe you can tell us if you tried to get him and what happened. But it brings us on to the question of regional parties. When you have an array of different regional leaders, I thought maybe the one we could comment on for regional balance is K.T. Ramarao from Telangana, because his interview was particularly interesting. But you have Aditya Thackeray from Maharashtra, you've got people from UP, have a range of different regional politicians. And so the regionalization of Indian politics, at least prior to the hegemony of the Modi Shah BJP, was really the main meta-narrative of Indian politics. And so I suppose I wondered what you felt you got out of speaking to the more regional politicians, given the conversation that we've been having. And Harsh, do you want to take that one?
Sure. James, KTR is a very interesting one, given the context of what we were just discussing with social movements. Here he is a dynast, but also in a unique way, a product of a social movement. The Telangana issue, his father, he both on the streets for many years, protesting, fighting for it, as he puts it in his words, shouting from the roofs of houses and buildings to get their way. What was interesting about his interview, like 2 or 3 things that really stood out. One, on the personal side, he talked at length about how he had to unlearn and relearn a lot of things that we, a lot of liberal politicians, liberal readers, viewers, and followers of Indian politics would think he shouldn't. He talked about how at first he was very uncomfortable with the idea of caste coming up in party meetings while allocating tickets to different individuals in the party, but how over time he had to reset and reorient himself to become comfortable, not just comfortable with it, but more supportive of it, given his understanding and evolution of his understanding of how important a role it plays on the ground, and how historically some castes and some communities were disadvantaged. More interesting for us was, here you have a person who is very strong votary of decentralization. If he had his way, the central union of India would only be doing few things like defense, foreign affairs, managing the economy, and the rest should be left to states. So he's a really strong votary of devolution, which makes sense given he's leading a state. He has a regional party. Very interesting views on why and how that would play out as well. So a couple of different interesting points there. Of course, there's a lot more in the interview about his fascination for technology, some of the work he's tried to do. But here we had a politician who's a dynast, product of a social movement, successful social movement. They were able to carve out a state, come to power in that state, and do a lot of other things.
Actually, may I just add something to that, Harsh? I think that was fabulous. And I think the only thing I'd like to add to that is something we were discussing, and I think I'd like to hear Barkha's take on this, which is there's this emerging tension between the centralization of Indian politics being run through the immense charisma and authority and power vested in the current prime minister, and the power and the role of these regional leaders. But the other thing we should keep in mind, and this I think it's something most people don't think about, that many of these regional leaders are extremely fond of devolution to the states, but they're not fond of devolving powers any further. So in fact, they don't want to devolve power necessarily to local governments. And I think what we are finding across India is that the devolution of power to local governments is quite limited. And the people standing in the way mostly are these state level politicians. And so despite the constitutional amendments, local governments remain remarkably weak for that reason. But, I'd like to hear what Barkha has to, say about this.
But we had a question from Kalyan Bose, who said she wanted to hear the views on the opportunity for these regional parties, particularly in the non-Hindi speaking states. So I wondered if you might pick up Pradeep's point and have a go at that.
So I actually think that regional parties are what are providing the challenge to the BJP much more than the Congress. The regional parties are doing a much more effective role of at least creating some road bumps in the way of the BJP juggernaut. I think otherwise you would have the BJP having a complete monopoly over political power if it were not for the regional parties. But there is something going on here which seems to me almost like a tacit arrangement between regional parties and the BJP. And by that, I mean that you will see these ferociously contested elections in the states. But once the regional parties are able to win those states from the BJP, you will see them not taking on the center. So let's take Orissa, for example, where you have a Naveen Patnaik. You will see Naveen Patnaik often voting alongside the BJP on some of the most controversial national legislations. You've seen KTR, who made this whole point to Harsh and Pradeep, but they don't really step outside of the national narrative as defined by the BJP. You see the same happening with the Jagan Reddy. So I find that regional parties are still tentative. They're like these lions in their own den, but the moment they have to play a hand of politics outside of the boundaries of their own states, they're suddenly unsure. One of the reasons, James, and you would know this with your own work in India, is because corruption is a highly politicized conversation in India. And by that, I mean that the power to turn anti-corruption agencies on your political opponents, a tool first sort of professionalized by the Congress and now perfected by the BJP at the center, continues to be something that can be used against these smaller parties that do not have that kind of wherewithal to take it on. Jagan Reddy still has a bunch of cases against him in court. He spent his life appearing every Friday before an anti-corruption court while he was doing this padyatra across India. So to my mind, regional parties can provide localized sort of resistance, but not national resistance or a national counter. And the second point is that in many ways, these chief ministers become like what I call mini Modis in their own states. So they take on the might of Modi when they're contesting him. And then when they win power, they become as centralized in how they actually distribute power in their own backyards. So in all the states, you're seeing a BJP-fication of politics, which is politics centered around one personality. That personality almost unilaterally controls the party and then is not necessarily very good at centralizing or sharing power with other groups and other individuals in that structure. So you're seeing a kind of, different variations of the Modi school of politics down the state.
Fascinating. We've got about 10 minutes to go. So I want to do some rapid fire audience questions in order to get through, because we've had some really good ones. So Harsh, this one's for you. And they're on two things that weren't in the book. One is a question from me, which is there weren't very many women in this book. And I wondered what you might say about that. Only 3, I think. Maybe I miscounted that, but not many. 4. And Burgess, 4. Okay, Burgess Godrej ask, what about the Aam Aadmi Party? This leads on from Barkha's point about sort of not quite regional, but minority parties with national aspirations. The Aam Aadmi Party didn't feature very heavily in your collection. So might you just say a quick minute on both of those points?
Yes, yes, absolutely. I mean, we would love to have had more women in the book. And I think looking back, there are one or two, Mahua Moitra being a good example that, you know, would have added a very unique voice. To some extent, this is a reflection of the composition of our prominent politicians, our parliament. So the book has about 20% women. Our parliament has less. Our state legislators have a lot less. We would have a part of this, of course, James, was being able to once again meet them in person, get access to them, get them to open up, get them to talk about different issues. And we didn't have total control all the time on exactly who would and who wouldn't. But to a large extent, I think we felt quite comfortable that given that we have women from the Congress, the BJP, regional parties, we felt quite comfortable that we're able to give at least enough good representation. Of course, at no point should, would I say that it's, we couldn't have had more and more very qualified ones to talk. As far as the Aam Aadmi Party is concerned, we of course, we would have loved to have them. I think there are two things to keep in mind. Of course, being situated in Delhi, the party gets a lot of national attention. But if you think about their actual political power relative to some of the other regional parties that we have covered, whether it's, the TRS with KTR, whether it's the National Conference on a topic as important as Kashmir at this time, whether it's the Shiv Sena that's now in government in a massive state like Maharashtra, whether it's Akhilesh Yadav with the Samajwadi Party, I think an argument could be made that the party's political power is slightly lower. And secondly, of course, we needed people to be under the cutoff of our age limit as well. So we wanted to make sure we would have a personality who could be there. Not to say that there isn't, but just didn't end up making the cut.
So let's raise our eyes a little bit. So this has been quite an India-focused conversation, as you'd expect. But Thomas Malayal asks a very interesting question, which is, what does the next generation of Indian political leaders think about the United States? Critical question at the moment, given the geopolitics of the region, India-China, China-US. Pradeep, there wasn't a lot of foreign policy in this book, but maybe you got a sense as to whether this coming generation of politicians is more comfortable with an India that is close to the United States, or more reticent about that in broad strokes? Could you give us a sense?
We did not raise this issue with them. So anything I'm going to say now is pure speculation. So, and if you want me to speculate, I can speculate. My guess is that for geopolitical reasons, India and the United States will have to draw closer to each other. And I think that is going to lead, and there are other people who've written on this and know this, actually going to lead to some fundamental rethinking of India's role, both within the region and how India approaches the region, as well as domestic Indian politics. So I think the geopolitics will force this. And I think there is I don't think any of these politicians has a strong feeling that they should be pro or anti-US in the sense, there was a time in the 60s and 70s when there was some purchase to be had to being an anti-US politician. I think that no longer exists. So my guess is realpolitik will drive their views. And I think realpolitik is tending in that direction.
Barkha, there are two questions about the role of the media. So Umar Akram talks about the BJP narrative being much stronger, and asks why the liberal left is not good at social media and YouTube. And then somebody who I presume is not actually called 1+5, although that may be the type of phone that they have. How important is the role of the mainstream media in supporting Modi's style of politics? I mean, is it a sense that Modi is dominant in the media simply because he's dominant in politics, or are they just better at using this new media ecosystem than everybody else? And if so, why?
I think it's both, right? I think the fact that mainstream media feels the need to be this supportive of a government in power is because the media is not as institutionally free as it should be. So from my perch, I look at Trump, and none of my American friends who are in media agree with this, but I say that, look, however much he sort of slams media and picks battles with media, he's not able to control what the media does in the US. And I think the First Amendment in the United States truly has cultural roots in that sense. In India, despite the fact that the BJP was at the vanguard of fighting the emergency imposed by Indira Gandhi, the BJP has done very well to capture mainstream media machinery, and they've not even had to do much. They're just a powerful political party, and TV channels in particular seem to have decided that they need to be on the right side of government. Now, to talk about, why is the opposition not picking up social media, there's also no doubt that you have to give credit to the BJP for coming to social media as an instrument of political messaging way quicker than anybody else, of using WhatsApp to do it way quicker, way more efficiently than anybody else. And the Congress was laggard at it. It came to it too slow. But please do study carefully, if you're an observer of India, a new law that was recently clarified that capped foreign direct investment in digital media. The government began to understand that the real energy of the country is now moving towards the digital space, that there's a staleness that has entered the television channel discourse, that it doesn't matter in the same way as it did before, it doesn't evoke respect, it's not taken seriously. And most serious media practitioners have actually moved out of television in the last 5 to 6 years. And now you have a situation where not just do you have a 26% cap in the FDI space, you need prior government approval to get that money. So that means that if I want to go and raise funds for my digital platform, I will need the government's consent to do that, right? So just by that one little government circular, the government has understood the power of this media, the digital space, and is seeking to control it. And we are just not institutionally free in the same way as some of our Western counterparts. I think that's been revealed. And the other thing that has been, that's my hunch, is that this will not stop with the BJP, that political parties have seen that mainstream media is willing to do this. And there is no reason that every single party will not now follow the same model, and in many ways does in the States already. Non-BJP parties are as controlling of the media in non-BJP ruled states. So I think this is a very, very worrying time for the Indian media.
Very good. Okay, we've basically run out of time, but I want to ask one final question, 15 seconds each, to Harsh and Pradeep, given the purpose of this is partly to get people to buy your book, which is an excellent book. So you have 20 profiles. Which is your favorite, or which was the most remarkable? If you were going to encourage people to read only one, obviously you should read all 20, which was the one that really stood out for you? Pradeep and then Harsh, and then I'll hand over to Margaret to close.
Smriti Irani.
And why? You've got 15 seconds.
I think she has an amazing, she has a very good, she has repartee, she's quick-witted, and I think her interview, she pretty much said what came to her mind.
Harsh?
I'd say Jignesh Mevani. Found him to be remarkably candid, very open to talking about his own failures and weaknesses, completely unprompted, very provocative, and a sharp contrast to a lot of the dynasts who've been schooled in politics since a young age.
Very good. Yes, I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to talk about the Mevani interview. I mean, it was really fascinating. Anyway, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you both very much for doing this book. It's a real contribution to understanding these politicians. I enjoyed it as a journalist, and often when you read interviews of politicians, you think, oh God, this is going to be really boring, and they're going to give all their normal pat answers. And it really wasn't like that at all. You got them to say things that journalists like Barkha and I often fail to do. So a real credit to you, and I would recommend our audience to pop out to Amazon and buy it. Anyway, thank you very much for that. It was a great pleasure to chat. Thank you to you, Barkha. I know it's very early in the morning in India. Let me hand over to Margaret to do our next steps.
Thank you very much. And the book title again is India Tomorrow, Conversations with the Next Generation of Political Leaders. We have the link to go ahead and purchase that in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. James, Pradeep, Harsh, and Barkha, thank you so much. That was a lot to cover in a very short time. We're going to have you come back. You got a lot of really good feedback in the Q&A and in the chat box. So thank you very, very much. We have our colleagues joining us here from the India Center. All of our centers, we have 13 of them around the world, are doing virtual programs. They're free for members, so please tune in. You can join them mostly for free if you are a member, and the website is asiasociety.org/online, so programs around the clock. Thank you for supporting Asia Society. Our mission is to build bridges, and if you aren't a member, please consider joining us. For those of us joining our VIP reception, where we're going to continue the conversation with our speakers, please click over to the second link that you received right before this program. A big thank you to our team. Rexel, your connections to Berkeley helped us make this happen. Thank you also to Pilar, James, and Michael. And from all of us at the Northern California Center, stay safe.